my initial thought about writing a book was I'd write a book about what's gone wrong with journalism and why. And then as I looked in further, more deeply into it, and looked more at these numbers, these polling numbers in particular, it was clear that trust has collapsed across the board in all of these institutions. Journalism, yes, academia, the government, law enforcement, big business, technology, public health, media, all these things. And so that's why I wrote. So I expanded the template, if you like, of the book to be a book about declining trust overall.
Let me introduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Gerry Baker. And Gerry is presently editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal and author of American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions and How We Can Rebuild Confidence. And I think I first got in touch with you because I had just read something that you wrote for the Wall Street Journal higher education slide from Veritas to quote, "My Truth." And I really liked the piece. After that, I read your book. Probably should have done that first. I have quite a few quotes from your book ready to read back to you and talk to you about. So let me dive in. And first of all, just get a little bit of personal history from you. I was interested in the dedication of the book that you dedicated it to Kitty, Claudia, Eliza, Arabella, and Scarlett. So let's just start there. Who are those people?
Those are my 5 daughters. I have 5 daughters, and so it was dedicated. Yes, it was dedicated to them.
And what's the age range of those kids right now?
Kitty, the eldest, is 29, and Scarlett, the youngest, is 19.
Excellent. Good. Well, I have 3 grown kids, 1 daughter, 2 sons, 5 grandchildren, 2 of which are girls. I do the daily childcare for the grandchildren who live across the street from me. So I'm knee deep in daughters and granddaughters myself. And
must be lovely. I have no granddaughters as yet, no grandchildren as yet. My second daughter just got married last year. No plans, I think, for any granddaughters yet, but I'm hoping won't be too long.
Did she get married in the States?
No, yes. She got married in Boston. She and her husband. Her husband is from just outside Boston, from Concord, Massachusetts, actually, and they got married in Concord, and they live nearby.
Oh, that's great. Well, last summer, Jeannie, my wife, and I were over in France as my grandson Ben got married to a lovely French young woman who met in university in Holland, where he was in school. And they asked me to come over and perform the wedding in her village near Reims. So we had a good summer, and it was lovely.
Lovely. That sounds a wonderful place to.
Yeah. So anyway, I'd like to jump into, first of all, you were the editor of the Wall Street Journal. You came over from the UK. By the way, did you go to boys' boarding schools, or how were you educated in the UK?
I went to all boys. What are in England were then, I think there are still a few of them around, called grammar schools, which England used to have, still does a little bit, but has a selective system of education at age 11, and if you pass a certain exam, back then you went to a particular school, and it was actually a Catholic grammar school, all boys, and I went there from the age of 11 to the age of 18, just outside.
And where was that? The grammar
outside London, in the suburb. Well, actually in London, in the suburbs of London, in southeast London, not far from a place called Sidcup, not far from Blackheath, Greenwich, but essentially in the kind of the outskirts of London.
Well, I ask because I was sent to British boarding schools. My parents were living in Switzerland. They were American evangelical missionaries who came over in 1947. And so I was in a little place called Great Walstead in Linfield in Sussex, near Haywards Heath, on the way to Brighton, if you left Victoria Station. And after that, up in what's the British call, and of course you'll know what I'm talking about, a public school up in Wales called St. David's College that I ran away from at 15.
Oh, wow.
Made it, and you'll appreciate this, made it all the way back to Switzerland via Hook of Holland and the ferry from Folkestone, sans passport, talking my way on board, attaching myself to a family, and I got all the way back to Switzerland. So that was the end of my British education.
Wow, that is quite an adventure.
Yeah, it was a good one.
So the school wasn't exactly Hogwarts then, by the sound of things.
No, it wasn't. It was not good. And the thing is, it contrasted horribly with the little prep school I'd been in that was run by a wonderful man called Gordon Park and his wife Eunice, and I had been spoiled there because they were like a second set of parents. And in fact, it was a wonderful experience for me to step out of my little evangelical community into sort of what for them was a low Church of England school, less ideologically driven, a little more freedom, and 280 acres. We were allowed to do as we pleased, build rafts, tree forts, whatever. It was a wonderful place. And then I went up to this rather dour public school, and it contrasted very horribly. I lasted 2 years.
Yeah, I'm saying that English boarding schools have, or English British boarding schools, you went to one in Wales, have a very mixed reputation. I mean, obviously, some people are scarred for life. One thinks of King Charles in particular, who went to a kind of particularly kind of hardcore.
Yeah, well, Gordonston wasn't a joyride.
My brother, however, went to a boarding school, Catholic boarding school in Cheltenham, in the west of England, and absolutely loved it. And again, I have many friends with views across the spectrum about their education. Some of them literally, again, like King Charles, would never ever send their children anywhere near the school that they went to, but some of them have incredibly warm memories and recollections. So it's it very much depends on the character. Well, obviously the nature of the school in the first place, but the character of the boy too, I suppose. But I didn't go. I went to a day school, a grammar school, a Catholic school, and then went off to university after that.
Yeah, well, I was lucky because the people who ran Great Wallstead were lovely, and to the point where when I was in my early 60s, thinking back over my life, I was writing a memoir at the time called Crazy for God, and that eventually came out. And in writing about them, I thought, I haven't done something. I haven't seen them since, and I want to go thank them. So I actually flew over to the UK and knocked on their door, said I was in the area and stopped by. Well, they wound up inviting me, and I stayed with them for 3 nights and reestablished. And then they came and visited my wife Jeannie and I here in the U.S. and they had never been to America. So in the end, I was able to round the circle and tell them what they had meant to me.
That's lovely. Yeah, it means a lot. I mean, teachers have such formative effects on our lives. I mean, everybody has some story. I have recollections of particular teachers, good and bad. One particularly terrible, awful, sadistic one who really made my life a misery for a few years, but a lot who genuinely, whatever good that may exist in me, other than obviously them from my parents and my family, they helped to implant it. So again, sort of a mixed picture.
And were you from a forgive me, but were you from a Roman Catholic family? I grew up in this very intense evangelical background. I'm always interested in the sort of religious, if any, formation in somebody's life.
Yeah, my family was a sort of practicing, pretty devout Catholic family. Both of my parents were Catholic. My mother's family were Irish. She was born in England, but both of her parents, my maternal grandparents, were both born in Ireland, and like most of the Irish, were Catholic and were pretty committed, observant Catholics. And my father, interestingly, his family were English, and I think there had been some Catholic antecedents some way back, but I think his own parents were not really observant, and he was baptized. But he's still with us. I'm glad. In fact, we'll be celebrating his 104th birthday next month, which is extraordinary. He fought in the Second World War, and he became for 6.5 years. He was in the British Army in the Second World War, and that turned him, as it does, with a lot of people, to read those military memoirs. It turned him into quite a religious, quite seriously religious. So yeah, I was brought up. I'm the youngest of 6 children, and we were all brought up as pretty serious Catholics.
Yeah, and did his experience in the war shape him in a way he would share? I ask that because I have a son who was in the United States Marine Corps during the beginning of the Afghan war, and he and I still have not talked about his experiences there, although he's the one that lives across the street with my 3 youngest grandchildren. We're very close. I don't think he has PTSD, but it was basically, I was there, I did that, I'm done. And I don't hear much about what actually happened. A few stories, that's it. I don't pry. I just wondered with your dad whether you grew up hearing things.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing, my father's a wonderful man, great father, brave man, all those kind of things. As it happens, his unit in the army didn't see a lot of fighting. They tended to be a kind of a support unit. They were actually sort of specialists. It was a unit called the Royal Army Service Corps, who they were kind of specialists. He was a carpenter, actually. That's how he got into the army. He built things. And so he didn't actually see a lot of fighting. But what he did was, he traveled all over. He was in North Africa, Southern Africa, and spent the last 2 or 3 years, I think the last 2 years in the Middle East, mostly in what was then Palestine, British Palestine, of course. and then in Syria too. Spent a lot of time in Syria, and I think it was actually for him partly the direct war experience. Again, as I say, he didn't see a lot of actual. Thank God he didn't see a lot of
Yeah.
combat. But it was more the experience of actually being, I think, in the Middle East and being in the Holy Land. And he visited all the places in the Holy Land, on duty and sort of while on leave. And I think he became very both sort of intellectually and kind of emotionally, sentimentally attracted to his faith, which again he'd been baptized in but hadn't been particularly observant of. So and then he remained a committed Catholic to this day. At 104, almost 104, he's still very much a committed Catholic.
When he was in Palestine at that time, was he in danger from, or aware of, or part of any of the back and forth with, Menachem Begin's outfit and the bombing of the St. David's Hotel and all that kind of?
He was there just before that. I think he was there for, I know he was in, it's interesting because we were looking some papers recently because he celebrated Palm Sunday, 1943 in Damascus. And he has an armed services pamphlet of mass, Palm Sunday mass in a church in Damascus in 1943. So I think he was there from 43 to I think maybe the beginning of 45 when he was then shipped back to Europe. So no is the simple answer. The Stern Gang, as they were known, of course, and then what I have to say, it's kind of ironic to see events these days in the Middle East. What the British routinely called terrorists. Sort of the Israeli nationalists back then.
Absolutely.
Really just kicking off at that point. And so I think by the time, again, I think the bombing of the King David Hotel, remind me, that was 47, I think maybe.
Yeah, I think it was, yeah.
He'd already gone by then. So he was aware of it. And then we've talked, he obviously, he's got dementia now, he doesn't remember much anymore. But in the past, we've talked a little bit about it. And he was aware of of what plans were going to be made for Palestine/Israel after the war. And he was aware of the strong sentiment of sort of Israeli nationalist, Jewish nationalist sentiment, but I don't think he saw any direct examples of conflict.
Yeah, of course, it kind of ties in an odd way with my own evangelical background, because when I grew up, every time Israel would win a war, my mother would say, oh, well, we're that much closer to the return of Christ. There, we're going to reestablish Israel. It's all part of the prophetic vision of evangelical Christianity in terms of the end times. And then you have this kind of very strong evangelical Christian Zionist movement. And then, of course, there's the actual Zionists, and then they got their break from Balfour and other British evangelicals that were heroes to my evangelical missionary parents, because they were they were substantially fulfilling prophecy from their point of view.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's
a rather different views.
No, I know you guys aren't half as crazy as we were. So.
Oh, we've got our own forms of crazy. So
hey, I was just on the Isola Bella down in Stresa last summer with my wife Jeannie, and I was looking at yet another dead saint in a glass box under an altar. And very fittingly for the local Roman Catholic Church, this was the dead saint of the family who owned the island since the 14th century and somehow managed to get one of theirs as a pope or a saint or something. So, the Catholics have their thing, don't they?
Oh, yeah. There's plenty of that. Plenty
of
those.
You guys have some stuff.
If all the relics of the true cross that I have seen around the world are actually real, then the true cross must have been about the size of the Empire State Building.
Yeah, pretty big. Hey, let me get to a couple things here from your book, which I really found interesting, and you make a terrific case that needs to be heard. I left my evangelical faith, and I'm a novelist and a writer, and I guess people would think I'm sort of a liberal, of a kind of an old school liberal, free speech kind of liberal, but also with a strong attachment to the kind of thing that you're writing about in two ways. First of all, you make a lot of terrific points in American Breakdown, and it's so beautifully written. You have some wonderful bits in there that I'm going to get to here. But in addition to that, I'm so sick and tired of one-dimensional podcasts, points of view, all the rest. And I'm not a journalist, but I talk to people, whether I agree or disagree, within a certain margin. And given the fact you were the editor of the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch, blah, 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 and so forth and so on. But I really liked your book. And I want to start from something that's actually fairly late in your book. I think it's page 105, just sort of set you up. You say, in late 2016, shortly after Donald Trump's surprise election to the presidency, I was approached by a distraught young editor at the Wall Street Journal who asked to come and see me for an urgent private discussion. I was editor-in-chief of the paper at the time, and had been aware of a rising level of consternation among some members of the Journal staff about our coverage of the election and the president-elect. And then you go on and you describe the fact that what she wanted you to do was sort of take a warrior, strong position against Trump, and you tried to remind her what journalism was about. And I think even though that's a late quote from your book, it's a good setup for who you are as a human. And what I read from you in your articles and also the rest of the book, you know, my listeners and followers are not will not be used to this, but we're talking to a real journalist today who actually believes in fairness and tries to tell the truth, and that's different. You then go on in your book and you talk about how the kind of academic community has seeded the journalistic profession with a lot of graduates with master's degrees and other things from Ivy League schools, that the old journeyman reporters have been replaced, that now it's a sort of a function of academic liberalism and the kind that community. So why don't we take it from there and then get into the rest of your book as we can, but just talk about how you feel journalism has changed, and not for the better, given the influence of the kind of hegemony of American left-wing universities, and then especially the Ivy League community. How has that changed journalism, and what's wrong with that?
Okay, so the first thing, so thank you for those, and thank you for obviously reading the book so carefully and making such interesting observations about it. I appreciate that very much. The first thing to say is I've been a journalist for approaching 40 years now. I didn't immediately go into journalism after university. I went to university. We just talked about my education. I went to university in England and then went actually into finance straight out of college for a couple of years. Hated it. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, and kind of almost backed into journalism in a completely unexpected way. But that was I was getting on for 40 years, 37, 38 years ago. And so I've been a journalist that long, initially starting out in television, and then after about 10 years moving to newspapers, the Financial Times initially. And I've been in the States. I've been a journalist working in the United States then since the end of 96. So for getting on for 30 years. So other than that first 10 years or so, my entire career has been in the United States, in US, first of all, again, with the Financial Times, then the Times of London, and then for the last 15 years with the Wall Street Journal. So I've seen journalism change quite significantly, change quite significantly over that 30/40 year period. And by the way, this was actually, in a way, this was the origin of the book. That I realized, it doesn't take a genius to realize, but perhaps one of the most striking and certainly one of the most depressing things about journalism, about America, however you want to describe it, over that period is the decline in trust in journalism. And, you know, I see this on a daily basis. Again, I'm glad to be able to accept the Wall Street Journal from this generally. I mean, but the Journal is still the most trusted newspaper in America. But even for the Journal, trust levels have declined in terms of this is measured by polling. But for broader journalism as a whole, for major news institutions, media institutions in this country, the decline in trust, again, is measured by these very reliable, you know, widely accepted polling organizations like Gallup and Pew and others. The collapse in trust in those institutions over precisely this 30-year period in which I've worked. I mean, I make a slight joke in the book that all of this has happened in almost precisely the time I've lived here. I hope it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that anything to do with me. But journalism, the trust in journalism has collapsed precipitously in that time. And it was looking at that and trying to. My initial thought about writing a book was I'd write a book about what's gone wrong with journalism and why. And then as I looked more deeply into it, and looked more at these numbers, these polling numbers in particular, it was clear that trust has collapsed across the board in all of these institutions. Journalism, yes, academia, the government, law enforcement, big business, technology, public health, media, all these things. And so that's why I expanded the template, if you like, of the book to be a book about declining trust overall. But since you're asking about media, and you cite that example that I give, a very earnest and very decent young journalist who I think is typical of the kind of modern journalist that has come into news organizations in the last 20 or 30 years or so, who just believed that I had just a completely different conception of what journalism should be. Believed that I think, if I may say so, and I don't mean to be unkind to this person, kind of rather naive view, as I say, I quote in the book, this person told me that, I didn't understand what was going on. We were now living in kind of Germany. It was now a repeat of Germany 1933. When Trump was elected, it was Hitler. The direct analogy was Hitler in 1933, and it was and journalism had failed back in Weimar Germany because it didn't stand up to the authorities, and what we needed to do was to directly oppose in a confrontational way the administration. And I said, again, that's partly a reflection of our different, upbringings and our different conceptions of what journalism is. But I also made the point, I'm not sure what the efficacy of that would have been. And in fact, unfortunately, what we've seen the efficacy of that over the last 7 or 8 years since that happened, which is that is exactly what a number of newspapers decided to do. And there's a very famous piece by, I think it was David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker, shortly after the 2016 election, where he said exactly that we're in a state of emergency. Trump represents a unique, unprecedented threat to freedom and democracy in America. It's the job of journalists. It's no longer enough for journalists to say, we're reporting this as it happened and we're trying to find the truth as best we can. It's our job to be campaigning and to stand up and to try to tear this administration down and tear Trump down. And I think what happened, and again, you can argue about the merits of that. It's kind of hard to argue that what happened over the next 7 or 8 years, first of all, Trump's still around, and indeed, probably, God help us, maybe about to be elected president once again this year. And journalism has been completely, the reputation of journalism doing exactly that, trying to campaign against journalism, has been completely trashed. Journalism has lost its authority, so much of its authority, partly through, I think and this was one of the things I dealt with as editor of the Journal a lot, this kind of crazy kind of, obsession with Trump and the attempt to pin things on Trump that just weren't pinnable on Trump, most obviously the Russia collusion story. And this campaigning journalism that tried to tear Trump down, one, didn't really succeed. Okay, you could argue maybe it did succeed. He didn't win the 2020 election, but I don't think it's fundamentally changed the politics of the country. And secondly, it has damaged the journalism. But let me just say one quick other thing. I'm no fan of Donald Trump. Believe me, I'm now a columnist.
Well, I know, having read the book carefully, you've got passages in there that are very,
that's exactly the point, if I may say so, Frank. It doesn't matter what my views of Donald Trump are and whether I think he's a bad man, as it happens, I do, and I think he was a bad president, and he would be a bad president if he was elected again. The job of journalism is to explain. If you like, terrible cliche, but it is to show, not to tell, right? And what's happened again, as a result, I think partly a result of these social changes among journalists and the type of people who become journalists in the last 30 years, they no longer want to go out and find out facts and tell you, hey, this is what happened. And, these are the important things that happened. And some people say this, but other people say this. And here's our best estimate to tell you what actually happened. That's not, by the way, on the other hand, journalism and saying you make your own mind up. It's getting to the truth. I believe there is such a thing as objective truth, and telling people that. But then people have to judge that themselves and say, okay, if you've laid out a very strong case, you've convinced me that that Donald Trump colluded with the Russians in order to get elected and is in fact a Russian agent. I'm convinced by that. The problem is when you don't convince people of that, you undermine faith in what you're doing. You undermine the trust that people have in what you're doing. And again, I'm afraid that is what's happened to American journalism, to so many other journalism in the UK, journalism in so much of the English-speaking world in the last 10 years. This campaigning journalism has failed to achieve the goals of its campaign, but has in the process completely undermined trust in the journalism itself.
Yeah, so this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Gerry Baker, who is the editor of the Wall Street Journal and now editor-at-large. And he's written a book that I find interesting and very well written and very thought-provoking, and a lot of speaking of truth in it and fairness. And that's American Breakdown. And I hope you read this because you need to, people who listen to this. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. I wanted to jump in and continue this line of thought on our conversation here. You talk about one of the problems with this kind of advocacy media is exacerbated by the online world, and I quote you, I think, from page 236, giving subscribers who more and more of the revenues to big news, giving subscribers who supply more and more of the revenues to big news organizations exactly what they want has created a dangerous cycle in which newspapers and other media chase more revenue by appealing more and more to the most partisan audience. And, that's one reason I seek out people from the Wall Street Journal or people who are writing for, points of view that represent what, quote unquote, my followers don't agree with, because this is precisely what I don't want to do, is create another little bubble that only makes everybody comfortable who tunes into what I say. But that's not why I brought that up. I brought that up so you can take that further and just talk about how you feel, because you have a very good section on big tech. I just think it's fabulous. It's worth the price of the book, amongst other things. But how does this universe, because you and I didn't grow up with cell phones, and I used to pick newspapers up off my front lawn, 2 or 3 that I subscribed to. That's all gone. And it was a baseline of knowledge. Didn't matter how you vote, you all kind of accepted what was in those. If they told you the economy was this, that, or the other, that's how it was. All gone now. We all have our little bubbles, and that includes my followers who get what they like or don't like from me. Everybody else. What is the relationship between what we're talking about with this university-educated elitist group of people, and the bubble we're in terms of then just feeding what that little group wants to hear anyway, and then it just gets narrower and narrower? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Frank, and and again, thank you for making those points from the book. Yes, exactly. So again, you have a number of factors that have led to the increasing distrust of traditional news organizations and the increasing partisan and, as you say, advocacy-driven nature of news organizations. The first, which we've talked about, is this new generation, this new cohort of journalists who have come in, certainly in the last 30, 40, even 50 years. Two things I'd say about them. One is, again, they're highly educated, expensively educated. They have a particular, they have a sense of mission, sense of purpose. They don't think it's good enough to tell people what happened. They need to tell people how to think.
Right.
I think Watergate was a key factor, by the way, in transforming journalism in this way. People suddenly came to realize that Watergate, journalists could have these incredibly powerful people who could bring down a president. So I think that led to the influx into the journalism profession of hundreds of thousands, probably over the last 50 or 60 years, of people with a real agenda, with a real commitment, with a real sense of their own power and mission and authority. And I think that's undermined journalism. But a big factor, crucial factor, is this sort of almost technical one, commercial consideration, which has really compounded that problem and has actually made it much worse. Look, newspapers, as you know, and this applies particularly to newspapers, but to some extent to TV news too, but particularly to newspapers. Newspapers, as you know, used to rely for their revenue on advertising. Back in the 2000s, as recently as 2000, the Wall Street Journal, I'll give you that example, something like 90%, 85, 90% of its total revenues came from advertising. It made billions, certainly hundreds of millions, in excess of $1 billion, certainly in today's money, billions from advertising. People, and that's how it works. Papers, Journal reached 2 million people. New York Times at that stage maybe reached 1.5 million people. Advertisers wanted to put their products in front of those, read often, especially the Journal, the Times, quite affluent, well-educated people with lots of disposable income. They would pay a fortune to do that. The advertisers didn't really care what the content was, as long as it wasn't defamatory, as long as it wasn't offensive, as long as it wasn't, in some way, wildly inappropriate, or certainly as long as it wasn't injurious to them directly. They didn't mind. They just wanted a full page ad in the Wall Street Journal. You'd pay, tens of thousands, again in today's money, probably $100,000 for, because you wanted to reach that audience. That was where the money came from. That left the editors of the news organizations, of the newspapers, largely free to pursue their own journalism and to do journalism, whether it offended one side or the other side of the political spectrum, didn't matter. Beginning in 2000, with the advent of of Google and then later Facebook, advertising, and obviously the consumption of news and information online, advertising migrated en masse to those digital outlets. So again, I can speak very personally and directly about the Wall Street Journal. We don't talk about, I don't think we've released these figures publicly, but between 2000 and 2010, that dramatic period when all of that change went on, when advertising went to Google and Facebook, journal advertising declined by something like 75%. Journal revenue declined by something like 75%. So same I know is true for the New York Times, Washington Post. All the major newspapers suffered a collapse in their advertising revenue. Now, when that revenue is 80, 90% of your total revenue, that's an extinction event. That's an extinction level event for a news organization, and its revenue disappears like that. What happened is what we did, and we were the first to do it at the Journal. Others then copied us. We very clever, and again, I collect no credit whatsoever for me. My bosses, very clever, much smarter business people than I, realize that what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to replace it. If we're either going to disappear or dramatically shrink, or we're going to have to replace that revenue from somewhere. And the way that to replace that revenue, it came from digital subscriptions. Initially, if you remember, when the internet started, not the Journal, but most news organizations initially put their content out for free. The Journal didn't.
And the Journal went right away to a subscription base.
Right from the start, and then others followed over, 5-10 years later. And over time, that's the good news for newspapers is that subscription revenue has replaced almost all of the advertising revenue that was lost, and there's still a little bit of advertising revenue too. So the Wall Street Journal right now is in better shape financially than it's been for years. Significant revenue, significant profit. The New York Times, the numbers are all a bit fuzzy, but the New York Times claims something like 6 or 7 million subscribers now, whereas at its peak in the glory days of print, it had maybe 1.5 million. So its total subscriptions are dramatically higher. The revenues are a little bit different because not everybody pays a full subscription rate, but they've replaced most of that revenue that they've lost on advertising with subscription revenue. The key factor, though, Frank, and this is where your point comes in, is that in doing that, they now produce a product which they sell, which the content of which they sell essentially they sell directly to their audience, to their readers. Revenue comes from people who are paying $300, $400, $500 a year, whatever it may be, for the paper, to read stuff. And what that means is those people are very sensitive to what they read. And if they don't like what they read, if they think, and this happens all the time at the New York Times, I should say again, and I don't want to keep sort of sounding like the Wall Street Journal is the good boy here, but actually because the Journal's news coverage, it tends to be heavily business oriented. It's not as susceptible to this. But the Times, and don't take my word for it, take the word of James Bennett, who wrote this very, very interesting long piece in The Economist just over the Christmas holidays. He describes exactly this phenomenon that something like, and I think I'm quoting his numbers correctly in the article he wrote. The new subscribers to the Times, as they came on board and provided all this to the Times, was something like 90% Democrats, and in most of them quite left-wing, quite left-wing Democrats. So they were subscribing to the Times not for a kind of dispassionate series of reporting and comment and analysis and commentary on what's going on in the world. They wanted to hear what they wanted to hear and read what they wanted to read. That Donald Trump is an evil person. That Well,
they were approaching it like people sign on to Facebook groups.
The country was profoundly racist. So they wanted to hear it. So that created its own incentive, an additional incentive to this crew of journalists who already believed most of this stuff anyway, already subscribed to this ideology in the first place. It made them even more inclined to do that kind of journalism because there was a commercial incentive for them to do it. And that is exactly what has happened to American newspapers, particularly the New York Times, but others too. They've become these organizations largely staffed by a sort of radical, progressive crowd, way removed from the kind of the mainstream of American American politics. And they are read by, and their revenues are supplied by, their wages are paid by 6, 7, 8 million people who are exactly in that, or in exactly the same political silo. So
it becomes a closed loop with a monetary interest.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a question for you. I want to go back to something basic that you said. I think this is from the introduction. I have to check the page number here. Yeah, it's early in the book, page 10, but it sets up your entire book. Obviously, it's the introduction. As I reflected on the steadily growing rot in the American project, it became clear that a common factor lay behind the national breakdown. And then you talk about the national breakdown of trust. Trust, the essential bond that holds any society together, was unraveling. And basically every chapter in your book after that, whether it's journalism or the media or even medical practice, you chart in each chapter very well, I think, and very convincingly, the breakdown in trust. It would surprise me if anybody who read this book from any kind of reasonable point of view would disagree with your analysis of the breakdown of trust. We all know that has happened. And of course, we always want to point to someone else. Oh, Donald Trump did the whole thing, but if you're from the left or from the right, the liberals, blah, 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 blah. But you have a sort of a different point of view. You say, on the one hand, the elites, the new establishment, expensively educated, versed in all the modern progressive nostrums of the age on American culture, society, and history. For this group, who comprise much of the nation's political leadership, almost its entire academic establishment, most of the people who control its news and cultural output, and a good deal of its corporate elite, the United States has never escaped its legacy of being an irredeemably malignant force for oppression and privilege. This modern elite rejects the idea that America has been a great force for good. And that's a paragraph that not only I think is well put together and reflects your whole book, but it's one I would agree with, in the sense that, having been raised in Europe, and I was born in 1952, my parents ran a mission. In that mission were many escapees from the East Bloc. Marika arrived with her feet bloody and bandaged because she had crawled over snow and barbed wire to get to the West. I listened to the tanks rolling into Prague, et cetera, et cetera. I'm old enough to remember a world in which there were people grateful all over Europe, even in France, believe it or not, who would come up and say, "You're an American. The only reason we have our country is because of your countrymen. Thank you." Tell you one tiny little anecdote. I met a young French girl about 12 years ago. Jeannie and I were walking in France in an area where there were cave dwellings in the old days, and she was on a farm about 11. We got to know her and her family, and about 3 years later, out of the blue, I get a little file of sand, and from this lovely child who by that time was probably 15, and she said, "My parents and I were on Omaha Beach, and I wanted to send you this sand from where your countrymen bled and died for my country." That's also America. So I totally agree with you. I hate the idea that we now can't even say that America was a force for good in anything it's ever done, that it's all about oppression and minorities. It's all about this, that, and the other. Last little point I'll make. It shows such a lack of understanding of a history. I'll just point to one thing. You want to talk about colonialism? What about the Ottoman Empire? Right. At the gates of Vienna, trying to invade Europe? What about the entire North African continent that is nothing except an Arab invasion from the deserts, spreading Islam by the sword, never by evangelism? The problem is that oppression has always been there, but the idea that it's the focus of a white kind of North American or European nationalism is just absurd, just from the point of view of history. Sorry for the sermon, but I'd like you to really take us there.
I so agree with everything you said. Let me just give you one other very brief anecdote. That's a very moving anecdote you give. I'll give you one. I lived in Japan for several years, covering Japan for the Financial Times, and several of my colleagues were Japanese, and I remember one of them telling me that her father had one of his most vivid memories of he was quite young, he was a boy, I suppose, towards the end of the Second World War, the American occupation of Japan after Japan had surrendered. Her father remembers that they lived in sort of Western Japan or something. That's the first time they saw American forces. They came through the village, the town where he lived, and they were in trucks. And as they were going through the village, they were throwing boxes out of the back of the truck. And initially the kids all ran away. Remember, Japan again. Sure. Japan's a great country, but when Japan went and invaded another country and occupied another country, it raped and pillaged and murdered and bayoneted people and killed literally millions of people. That's what they did. The Americans came to Japan. They were throwing these boxes out. The kids thought, "Oh my God, is it a bomb? Is it some sort of poison? What is it?" And after a while, a couple of the kids, my friend's father, had the sort of bravery of the kids' bravery to go up and start opening the boxes, and it was boxes of chocolate. Yeah. And I find that a very moving story. That captures absolutely how different America, and I must say, Britain too, has been. That's not, so the idea, that's what so offends me about this idea that all American history is a history of oppression, when actually more people in the world today owe their liberty, owe their life to the fact that Americans were willing to fight and die for America. Obviously, that was their primary obligation, but for the very ideas that America was founded on. So that is the problem. And look, by the way, of course, it's necessary to say this. None of that is to say that America has a pure history. I mean, God knows and one of the things I find really frustrating when I talk to people about this is this idea that somehow Americans it's only in the last 10 years since the sort of critical race theory and DEI movements have grown up, that Americans have been taught about slavery or the Civil War. I mean, I'm English. I'm I'm over 60 years old. I was educated in as a small child in the 60s and then 70s. We learned about we knew what the Civil War was about, and Pache, Nikki Haley. We knew what was going on. We knew that we knew what slavery was. We knew what an abomination it was, how evil it was. I don't think there are many Americans, if I may be so bold, who grew up thinking somehow, well, slavery, wasn't a bad thing, states' rights and all that kind of stuff. Everybody knows how terrible slavery was and what a sin it was, and how the stain of that sin, I'm not denying that either, continues to infect America today. I say, by the way, to some of my more passionate conservative friends who think America has solved the race problem, I say to them, in my lifetime, again, I'm 60, just over 60, in my lifetime, there were parts of America where, African Americans were literally not allowed to step in the same place, ride the same bus, be in the same school. Do you honestly think, are we really making that much progress that sin, that crime, that discrimination has been completely extirpated? So I don't need any convincing that America is not perfect, that America has particularly on the issue of race, a terrible, terrible historical stain that it continues to have to work out. But it is, I think, willfully myopic to suggest that no progress has been made, which is
even contemporary issues that supposedly are such a big deal. Just take gay rights. It's not a coincidence that the United States was far ahead of most other countries in the world and still is today.
So Europe,
much more ahead of quote-unquote liberal left-wing Europe. I mean, the states led the way on gay rights, gay marriage, a whole bunch of things that are part of the progressive gospel. And even there, and I remember John Updike making a point in an article he wrote for the New Yorker a while before he died, saying, okay, we can complain about the US and a lot of things. And this was sort of on feminism, but just saying, it wasn't an accident that this is where the modern feminism you all subscribe to in order to criticize the patriarchy as an American capitalist phenomena.
Right.
Who do you think opened the door to this being a thing? Sort of what I would call the Gandhi principle of, yes, Winston Churchill was terrible about India maybe, and there was the racism and the empire. But on the other hand, I can't think of another imperial power that wouldn't have just shot Gandhi.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, all of that's
people don't have any sense of the history of it.
No, exactly. And that's the important point, I think, that, again, of course, we can acknowledge the crimes that were committed, not just the individual crimes, but the if you like, the kind of the collective crime, the state crime, that tolerated slavery, that tolerated discrimination well after slavery, Jim Crow, and for decades and decades, and also, and I will go this far, continues to tolerate levels of discrimination today that it shouldn't tolerate. But of course, we must keep that in mind. But where the kind of mental corruption occurs is when we allow that crime, that stain, to override everything else that the United States supposedly has ever done and stood for, and to indict the United States, and America, and as you say, to some extent, Britain, for that reason. By the way, just in passing, I say, and I'm glad to say, finally, Britain is now finally, after all this, after the whole monument destruction process that we've been through in the last few years, Britain, as you well know, Frank, not only abolished the slave trade, obviously abolished slavery and abolished the slave trade before the United States. Britain enforced the abolition of the slave trade with thousands and thousands and thousands of Royal Navy people, servicemen being killed, stopping the slave trade, and we literally, thanks to Britain alone, I should say, no one else. African countries weren't helping out. No European countries were helping out. In the 19th century, millions and millions of people were saved from slavery and their descendants because the Royal Navy, because the British government insisted on barring slavery, and finally they were erecting a monument to those people in Britain this year. So look, so all I'm saying is, we cannot look at America's history, what it stood for, how it was created, the founding fathers, their ideas. Of course, we can acknowledge that that many of them had slaves, and we can acknowledge the fundamental flaws that they almost all had, and the sin that again that was there very much present at the foundation. We can acknowledge all of that without rejecting the greatness of American virtues and values and what America has done for Americans, but also for
Yeah.
the world over the last
And
250 years.
there's a
We've lost
parallel
that.
to that. And you mentioned this in your book, comparing your visit to the Soviet Union to when you came to the States. Having grown up in Europe and gone to British schools and traveled quite a bit myself, when you talk, for instance, to left-wing environmental activists who act as if the environment would have been better off under a socialist or even communist regime rather than our capitalist system, obviously these people never understood the amount of unrestricted pollution by the corrupt governmental organizations that typified the whole East Bloc and turned it into one vast dead zone of filthy water, filthy air, people with shortening lifespans because of the thing. So I just want to turn both what you have in your book, but just your opinion. Speaking for myself now, I think there's a lot wrong with capitalism in the sense that you talk about in your book, which is this sort of growing divide between the have and the have-nots, the billionaire class and everybody else. Can you talk a little bit about how you frame this in your book, American Breakdown, but also go beyond that just to your point of view as someone who's observed our world well? How do you think this shakes out? Obviously, no one who's familiar with the actual history of communism or how socialism worked out in big chunks of the world thinks that that's a better model. On the other hand, the environmental concerns are real, and so is the divide between the wealthy, the super wealthy, and everyone else, and the tech bros and all the rest of this. As a snapshot of just you right now today, Gerry, where's your head at on this? Because I don't have an answer to this. I'm asking you what you think.
Well, I'm sorry to have to say I'm with you. I have to acknowledge a lot of humility. I have a lot of reasons to be humble, and this is one of them. I think I can identify the problem. I don't know how it shakes out. I have some ideas, and I'll share them. Look, I think this problem of inequality is I mean, I talked again, the framing of the book is trust. It's about why trust has collapsed, and we've talked about many of the reasons I cite in the book as why trust has collapsed, in particular the capture of these institutions by this sort of progressive elite, which I think has undermined faith in those institutions. But another very important thing I talk about in the book, and another reason for the decline in trust in these institutions and in America to some extent as an idea, and this is a really worrying thing, is this problem of inequality. America, again, let's be clear, inequality is an inevitable outcrop of a free market, right? That it's just going to happen. There are some people who are more talented, work harder, get luckier than others. That's the way capitalism works. It's a brilliant thing. It rewards talent, it rewards hard work, and sometimes, it rewards luck. But it's necessary to do that, and we know from now 250 years of economic history, and we have the perfect, it's very rare in history or kind of in sociology that you get an experiment, you get a real life experiment. We've had an experiment of capitalism, which largely is what the United States and Britain and other, some extent Western Europe has followed for much of the last certainly 50, 100 years. And we had the experiment of socialism, which is what the Soviet Union practiced. And to some extent, we can talk about China's a bit different, but we're seeing more of socialism in China now. And the outcomes were dramatically different. And again, you mentioned this, I say this in the introduction to my book. It was the first time it was really brought home to me when I visited the Soviet Union and the United States for the first time in the same year in the 1980s. And it just suddenly struck me in a way that 100 books didn't quite have that same effect. Right. I could see with my own eyes just what an absolute disaster socialism was. And I came to New York and America, and for all its chaos and mess and all of the kind of stuff, what an incredible dynamism, energy, and opportunity that the capitalism represented. So that, again, let's stipulate that capitalism works and is better, but there are limits, and I think we are exploring the limits of capitalist excess, if you like. And by the way, part of what I would argue is this actually isn't what part of the problem we have, and I talk about this a bit in the book, is why there's so much inequality has arisen is not because of too much free market capitalism, but because of not enough. I mean, I'm very much a believer in the idea that capitalism has been corrupted in the United States in the last 20 or 30 years by people call it crony capitalism, if you like, very powerful companies that have got bigger and bigger and bigger and been allowed to get bigger and bigger and bigger by government regulation, by the market, and one of the things I talk about in the book is the collapse of what economists call industrial concentration. That is the shrinking of the number of companies in each sector of the economy to just 4 or 5. And that when you have that, you don't have much competition. What you have is extraordinarily generous returns to the capitalists, to the owners, and to the managers who run the capital for them, and not much return to the workers. And that's exactly what we've seen. So we've got incredibly powerful companies that have been allowed to become powerful. The American political system allows them to do that by allowing them to buy extraordinary influence in Washington and state capitals and get regulations and get legislation that suits them. So we don't have a real genuine. Part of my argument of the book is that we need to return to a genuine dynamic free market capitalism where you have real competition and not this this crony capitalism that we have right now. So
Google and 3 other people kind of thing.
Yeah, well, it's true in every sector. Airlines, there's like 4 airlines that dominate the airline sector. Telecommunications, there are like 3 companies.
Well, and you talk about how these people all start out with this great ideal, and then what actually turns out to be. I mean, within our system, And
I just want to say, Frank, the reason this is so important, and again measured in polling terms, as we all know now, for the last 20 years or so, you ask Americans, do they think their children will have a better standard of living than they will? The answer by a large majority is no. That's never been the case in America before. That is inimical and totally contrary to the idea of the American dream. That that progress is something that we can expect. Again, you work hard, you're talented, you get all the breaks, you achieve, and you can succeed, and you do better than your parents. Most Americans don't believe that's working anymore. And that's a problem with the system. That means the system isn't working. And the rich here in this country, the advantage, but frankly, people like me and probably people like you, I can't speak for you, but I can speak for me. I've been very successful. I've done very well. I've got many, many people to thank for that. But they're kind of able to buy influence. This is again, what is so problematic for America. People like to think of America as a classless society where anybody can get on. That's true to some extent, but increasingly, you look at these universities, the admissions into these elite universities, the vast majority are people who went there themselves. They got legacies, or they've basically been able to buy a good education for their children to get them into those universities. Every time I go to major event, I do, one of the things I do in my job is I go to corporate events around the world. I speak to CEOs. You go to dinner with a bunch of CEOs, and they're all congratulating themselves because their daughters have just been admitted to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford. And that's great. Well done. Congratulations. But that's perpetuating this inequality and exacerbating this inequality. That's got to change. I think that has got to change. A country cannot survive with the levels of inequality and expansion of inequality that we're seeing here. We've got to do something about that. And again, I've got some answers, which I just mentioned there. Tackle the growth of industry, bring more competition, genuine competition into all of these sectors. Really give the opportunities to people who don't have the opportunities right now. Improve the education for those. There are some solutions like that. They're not very convincing solutions, but I know the problem, and we've got to the best people in this country have got to exercise their minds to address that problem. Otherwise, this country will not survive.
Yeah, you have a great little story that you tell here. Somewhere toward the third of the way through the book, I think page 70 something. Speaking of these elites and their self-regard, you tell one story at one point in the book about how the New York Times editor thought that the acting editor thought the next building to be hit in 9/11 would be the New York Times because of this self-important thing, that obviously they would be the next target because they're so important. But the story I want to cite is you're talking about a state dinner, I think, in the White House with Barack Obama that you were reporting on. The top table was a tapestry of the modern hierarchy of corporate America, seated on either side of the president and first lady and Chairman Chinese Xi and his wife Peng. I can't pronounce her name. Luan. Yeah. Were the titans of Silicon Valley and Hollywood. Most prominent among them, Chief Executive Tim Cook of Apple, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, with his Chinese-American wife, Priscilla Chan, Bob Iger of Disney. Each CEO got a few precious minutes face-to-face with the Chinese leader and used the opportunity to plead with the communist emperor for some special treatment for their business. One of the CEOs who was there described to me the scene that unfolded. Zuckerberg told Xi that his wife was soon expecting their first child. He wondered if the Chinese president might like to suggest a Chinese name for them to bestow on the firstborn. No, he replied coldly. A little puzzled, Iger told Xi that Disney would be launching its latest theme park in Shanghai soon and beseeched the Chinese leader to come and take part in the opening festivities. No, said Xi. Cook noted that Apple now had hundreds of stores across China and hoped that one of them might soon be graced by a visit from the successor to the mandate of heaven? No. And then you say the three no's, as some future Chinese chronicler may one day label the episode, must have created an atmosphere of excruciating awkwardness. First of all, what a wonderful piece of writing. I just love that story. But I also think that in that story, you kind of told the story that you've just been talking about. I mean, who the hell do these guys think they are?
Yeah.
I mean, basically, would they have done this with Mao or Stalin or Pol Pot, or just what the hell? How do you see that? I mean, what's wrong with these corporate American leaders that they would do that? And secondly, doesn't that story just say everything you want to say about what you've just been talking about? It seemed to me jumped off.
Thanks for picking up on that. And I do remember that dinner quite vividly for all kinds of reasons. Yeah, exactly, Frank. That is, that there's this, and again, that comes in the context where I'm describing how American companies, why trust in big companies, big business has collapsed in the US, and because in large part, because they've done things like that, which is that they've put their own corporate profits, their own interests, the pursuit of the interests of the managers and the shareholders of those companies ahead of the larger interests of the company and its customers and its workers themselves, to the point where they almost literally, be very carefully, just stop short of saying literally, almost literally kowtow themselves before the leader of, the leader of communist China, begging him to dispense some of his favors in their direction. And that, and I think the whole problem of I talk about globalization in this context, in this book. This is, one of the things one of the reasons that people don't trust companies is that those companies went overseas, didn't care about, they were no longer American companies. In fact, I used to hear American chief executives talking about they weren't American companies, they were global companies. They had no particular obligation. And they moved in circles in which, they had more in common with people in London and Shanghai and Frankfurt and, Sydney than they had any interest in people in Des Moines and Dubuque and wherever else, or Dover, Delaware, and that, to me, that's a problem. I'm not suggesting that they have to be, of course their job is to put their shareholders' interest first, but we've allowed a system to develop which almost requires them to pursue that shareholder interest through the undermining of the American worker and the American workforce, and indeed America itself, to the point, again, and we saw this, with that after its extraordinary performances, when, while they were all taking part in these protests about how terribly racist America was during the whole Black Lives Matter era in 2020, and companies were coming out and demonstrating their bona fides with Black Lives Matter and saying, what a terrible country, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on DEI initiatives and all this kind of stuff, while they were going to China singing the praises of the communist government of China, which literally, by the way, again, whatever America's faults, literally is carrying out what some people describe as a genocide, but certainly mass murder of people in parts of China, which denies people in China the right to express themselves, which demands absolute subservience to the state. These companies, these corporate leaders were going out there saying wonderful things about what a great country China was while they were trashing their own country. That's one of the reasons people have lost faith in their corporate leadership as well.
Not only trashing our country, while doing that, some of these guys selling the technology to the Chinese Communist Party that is being used to not just suppress dissent, but kill people by identifying them with everything from facial recognition and so forth. We have been talking here. My guest has been Gerard Baker, editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal and the author of a wonderful book called American Breakdown that I enjoyed reading immensely. I want to conclude just by asking my readers or listeners, I write too much, to please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said commentary at frankschaeffer.substack.com. I had one last little question for you. I had just been talking with David Frum, the writer, and Tim Alberta as well, who's written this book called The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory on what's happened to the evangelical movement in the Trump years. And I asked them a question I'm going to ask you, and that is, what is the role of the media in an age of information overload? Which we've sort of talked about in terms of all these little bubbles, but just how do you see that? And also, if you want to segue into something about the solutions that you lay out in the last part of your book that we haven't had time to get to, as they impact what we've just talked about. We've talked a little bit about the capitalist thing, but let's go back to the media a little bit.
Yeah, just very briefly. I'd say I actually believe it's going to sound very simplistic. I actually believe the way for them, you're absolutely right. We've seen an explosion of media, mass media. People get their information from, everywhere. When you and I were growing up, as you say, you pick the papers up off the lawn, you watch the nightly news in the evening. Maybe you listen to radio news, I did in Britain quite a bit. That was it. Those were your sources of news. Now there is literally unlimited sources of information and news. Much of it unreliable, much of it, deliberately misleading, or at least in pursuit of a particular agenda. I genuinely think that the answer for the traditional, should we call them that, in this sort of Tower of Babel of different voices shouting different things to people, I think this is a great opportunity actually for traditional media to go back to doing what they're supposed to do, which is to calmly, dispassionately, without advocacy, without ideological commitment, to just go and find out what's going on. Tell people. That's the way you build trust. Tell people, genuinely reporting what's happened, doing it not in pursuit of an agenda, but simply in pursuit of the truth. Because so few people are doing that. And, that's certainly not what most of these new sources of information, whether it be,
No.
sharing information on Facebook, or,
Right.
new digital news organizations that have grown up, these highly partisan, they're not doing that. There's a tremendous opportunity, actually, an opening. I think there is, despite what we've talked about the way in which news organizations now sell themselves essentially to people of a particular ideological disposition. I think there's still a vast opportunity for people. People just want to know what's going on. Again, I speak from the Wall Street Journal's perspective to some extent, and we are different and perhaps to some extent fortunate in that a lot of our reporting is financial, economic, business based, and people need that. If they need reliable information, they don't really care. Notwithstanding what we've said about some of these companies, they don't really care to know, what what Donald Trump may have said yesterday, or what Hunter Biden may have done with a prostitute a few years ago. They do need to know whether Microsoft is going to meet its targets, meet its forecast this quarter, or whether the U.S. economy is growing at such and such a rate or not. So we're a bit fortunate in that respect. But I think that there's a lesson in that too, which is that there are hard facts that people need to have that determine the way in which they live, determine the way their choices in life, their social choices, their business, consumer choices, and yes, their political choices. And they need that information. I think the traditional media would do really well by, everybody understands it's not perfect. Everybody understands it's going to make mistakes. But by recommitting itself to the idea of truth and facts and objective reporting. And I think that would be a tremendous step forward for them. And I think obviously society would benefit enormously too.
Two points to close out on. One, I would like, if with your permission, to add your book to my book club called It Has to Be Read.
Thank you very much.
That puts it on a list of books that I think are absolutely essential. Yours is one of them. We have a range of books, but I really, really was taken with it. I hope we can do that. So thank you. And then the other thing, I have a quick question, just a follow-up to your last comment. You had that story about meeting a young journalist. Have you made any converts in the sense that, have you been able to sit down? I'm a proponent of marriage. I've been married to the same woman since I got Jeannie pregnant when we were 17 and 18. And I have some young people that I know who couldn't even figure out how to date, but they've seen Jeannie and they've seen me with my grandchildren. And basically they've actually said to me at some points, well, how did you do this? And you're able to give some just simple advice. And I get Christmas cards once in a while from people who got married and had kids, and it's a great joy to me. And I'm wondering, apropos of that young journalist you talked to who was all hyped up to go do her little bit of propaganda good, do you know any kids or younger people who have come out of the Ivy League ready to do this thing and work for the Times or you or whoever, who have said, I'm gonna be part of this better journalism. I think we've gone too far that other way. Is there anybody changing their mind on this? Or
yes, very much. I mean, I've certainly had gratifying responses to the book, but way beyond anything I can contribute, there is something changing. People are starting to say, this has gone too far. We need to get back to traditional values. Let me give you a nice story that a few years ago, I think when I was editor, or maybe no, I think I just stopped being editor, but someone at a rival publication recommended a reporter, and I can't remember if I refer to this story in the book. I think I do, but a rival publication recommended someone to me, and said, this is a brilliant young reporter, absolutely superb. We're working for a magazine, actually, like a news magazine, 25 years old, just 3 or 4 years out of college. He said, this person was absolutely brilliant. He said, I'll give you, and also completely committed to the idea of real reporting and journalism. He said, and this note he sent me, he said, I'll give you an explanation of why, I'll give you an example of what he's like. He said, after he'd been here for a year or two, When his editor called him in and said, you do really, really well. It's great that you do this reporting. We love you do your reporting. But, a lot of people your age, they're very ambitious. They want to, they want a column. They want to write columns and commentary. And the kid apparently just said to him, I'm 25 years old. Who the hell cares what I think? And, I think, a little bit more of that humility, a little bit more of that recognition of the need for less of what I think and more of what people actually need to know and more of what's actually going on. And I think it is happening, Frank. I think, look, it's going to be slow. It's going to be, tortuous. It's going to be uneven. But I think there is a recognition that this has just gone too far and that we can actually, it's time to start reasserting the importance of the traditional values.
Well, here to that, and we'll put American Breakdown in our book club and
thank you very
follow
much.
You with interest, and all the best. And
thank you very much, Frank.
Thanks for writing a terrific book, and also
you're very kind. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me on. Congratulations with the podcast and the Substack. I think it's on Substack, right? You're writing, and it's a real pleasure, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Same here. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Bye-bye.